with you this morning. Over the last for this opportunity to share the Word of God with you this morning. The residents in that neighborhood woke up to a deafening sound of a gunshot very early in the morning. And the police went to that hotel and they went to the room. They found a dead man. The investigation agencies, starting with the FBI and a whole lot of others, came in and started looking at this case. And they found out that this man was a person called Etobicoke. He was a Russian, and he had defected from Russia while he was sailing on a boat near the coast of Canada. He came onto the Canadian shores, and from here he was taken to the US. Sergei was a bodybuilder, a boxer, but he was also part of the intelligence wing in the Soviet Union. Now, for those of you who are young, you may be wondering what this map is. This is a map of the Soviet Union, which is no longer there today. The major part of the Soviet Union was Russia and 16 other countries. They were all part of a large confederation, and they were the second superpower in those days, till the late 90s. And what we see from history is that Sergei had defected to the US. He was a very important person. They found him dead one morning in 1973. I'm going to come back to the story a little bit later. Just keep this in mind as we go through the sermon this morning. We've been studying from 1 Peter, and we've just finished 2 weeks in this series of studies. The subject is living victoriously in a broken world, and the topic for me is to look at how we live victoriously according to our position. The passage this morning is from 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 11 all the way to 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 7. I'm not going to read the passage because it'll take us time, but as we go through the different sections of this passage and draw our lessons from it, we'll read a few verses here and there. I think the context has been established very well for us in this letter through the last two sermons. We understood that the letter was written by the Apostle Peter. It was written to the Jews who were scattered across Rome, Central Asia, and parts of the Arab world and North Africa. They were spread out. They had to go across these lands because there was so much persecution against them in Jerusalem. But as they moved to different parts of the world, wherever God placed them, small assemblies started coming together. And then through the work of those assemblies and missionaries, we understand that people came to the Lord in those cities. Some were people of a lot of authority who came to the Lord. Some were slaves. And in some households, only one parent, that means either the husband or the wife, would have come to that saving experience. This was the experience in that first 100 years when the church went through a lot of persecution and was scattered across these places. Now, the first two sermons gave us a bit of insight into what it means to live in this broken world. Remember, when the Apostle Peter wrote this letter, it was literally a broken world for the Christians. They were hated. They were not allowed to be part of society. They went through a lot of problems, and it was literally a broken world. In our first sermon that we heard from our brother Matthew Sebastian, we were told, or we were given a better appreciation of what it means to have our salvation in Christ. We were blessed to hear that we are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God, that we have been redeemed and that we have been sanctified by His grace. We were also told and taught that we have a royal status, a royal priesthood. We are a holy nation and we are a peculiar people. And finally, we heard that we are living stones that's being built together, compacted together, coming together as a spiritual home where we have Christ as our foundation. In the second sermon from Brother K.C. Abraham, we heard about what it means to be holy, why we are called to holiness. We learned that holiness is based on God's character. And we are encouraged to strive for holiness because Christ paid a heavy price for us. We also heard in that message that our holiness is shown in the brotherly love and the sacrificial love that we have for one another. And finally, we heard that holiness is the fruit of spiritual growth. By the way, he was my father. So you heard from the father last week, now listen to the son. Now this morning, I'm going to get into my sermon, and I just pray that keep me in prayer as we go through the different parts of these verses from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 to chapter 3, verse 7. As you read these verses and go through them line by line, we find a certain character in God's people. What is that character? There are three words that came to my mind as I went through those verses. Probably you will have other words to think of. One is that we are distinct. Two, we are self-controlled. And three, we are influencing. These are the three words that sort of summarizes this passage. The three characters that we need to understand has come to us, and we have a responsibility to show, to exhibit to the world. As God's people, we are distinct, meaning that we are spiritual. We consider ourselves as strangers in this world. We are submissive to authorities, and we are respectful. The next part is we are self-controlled by godly nature. We don't compromise with sin. We practice love, not lust. And finally, we are influencing people. In other words, we show our influence on society through our godliness, through the grace, through forgiveness, and through love. Now, as I read through these verses, the first thing that came to my mind is it's almost impossible for us to be all of these things at any given time. We will all fail. This morning we heard in the message where all have fallen short of the glory of God. And in so many ways, this is the ideal believer that we see in front of us. The ideal Christian believer is distinct, self-controlled, and influencing. There are about 11 characters that are mentioned there. So the question this morning is, can we meet those requirements every day and every moment of our life? And the answer is probably no. At any given time, we would be failing in one of these. But then, the Apostle Peter is encouraging us to read these passages and strive to take on these characters. Now, keeping those three words in mind, number one, distinct, self-controlled, and being influencing, when we look at this passage, we understand that we have been given four responsibilities in this world. To be pilgrims, to be model citizens, to be ideal and submissive servants, and to build model homes. One, to be pilgrims, to be model citizens, to be submissive servants, and to build the ideal home. What does it mean? Pilgrims, as you know, don't have a legal status. They are passing through. This is not their home. They are temporary residents. And they don't have a permanent position anywhere that they travel through. They're just journeying through that place. As servants, we need to understand that we have a dual citizenship. We belong to heaven and we belong to earth. This is a challenge that the apostle is giving to us this morning. We need to live our lives in this world, understanding that we are citizens of heaven while we live as citizens of earth. We belong to this world, no doubt, but we also are not part of this world. In other words, we're not adapting to the sin of this world. We are submissive servants, we contribute and we abide with the law. Next part of it that we see here is about marriage and the requirements that are given to us is found in chapter 3, verse 1 to 7. We read about godly submission, genuine love, and building model homes. So this is just an introduction for us as we step into this passage. Remember, we are pilgrims. That means we don't belong to this world. We need to model ourselves as the ideal citizens of heaven and citizens of earth, submissive servants, and building model homes. Keeping these thoughts in mind, let's look at two particular verses from 1 Peter chapter 2. Turn with me to your Bibles. Chapter 2, verse 21 to verse 23. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 to 23. For you were called to this, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. Notice the text very carefully. For you were called to this because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you with an example. If you have your pens, you may want to underline that one phrase, leaving you with an example, so that you should follow in his footsteps. He did not commit sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. When reviled, he did not revile in return. When suffering, he did not threaten, but committed himself to the one who judges. While I was preparing for this message, the thought that came to mind, one of the questions was, where do I find a core passage or a core verse from this passage? Where do I find a starting point? And I was battling with this for several weeks, trying to see what would be a good starting point. And that's when I came across this particular passage. And what struck me most with this was this one sentence there in verse 21, which says that Christ has left us with an example. He is our example. When we look at Hebrews chapter 12, we see in those verses, the first two verses, that he endured suffering for the joy, having sight of the joy that was kept in front of him. In other words, he saw you and me in this Hilltop chapel. He saw us ahead of time. That was that joy that he saw ahead of time. And that is how he endured that suffering. And that joy helped him or motivated him to be a citizen of heaven and a citizen of earth. But when you carefully look at verse 22 and verse 23, it speaks about his death. The response that Christ had as he was being crucified and as he went through all those sufferings on the cross. While you look at verse 22 and verse 23, picture in your mind that journey from the point where he was arrested in the garden to meeting the high priest, and then all the way to Pilate and Herod, and finally walking down that path with the cross and being nailed on that cross of Calvary. Keeping that in mind, what was the example that he set for us? What was that example? The purpose of my message today is not to analyze what Christ did for us on the cross. We've already done that. We keep reminding ourselves every time we gather for worship. But if you carefully look at the response that Christ had that our Lord had on the cross of Calvary, there are probably 7 characters or 7 important qualities of Christ that we can see on the cross of Calvary. And that goes with how he responded to being persecuted, or how he responded to all the sufferings that he had to go through. On the cross, you find him to be a forgiving person. You find him to be evangelistic when he reached out to the other thief who was crucified next to him. You find selfless love in him. You find holiness in him. On the cross, he understood and he proclaimed to the world that God had rejected him for all mankind. You find him patiently enduring suffering. You find him complete in his work. And you find him entrusting himself to the righteous judge. Forgiveness, evangelistic, being selfless, holiness in all parts of his life, enduring suffering, being complete, and entrusting himself. Now look at the 4-fold duties that we have as a Christian. You see, Christ left us with an example to live in this world. If you apply these 7 qualities to the passage that we have been given from 1 Peter chapter 2 and chapter 3, apply these 7 qualities to each one of them. To live as pilgrims, apply the 7 qualities. To live as citizens of heaven on earth, apply the same 7 qualities. To be model servants and submissive servants, apply the same 7 qualities. And to build model homes, apply the same 7 qualities. This was a starting point that I was desperately looking for when I was reading through this passage. And it impressed upon me that unless we condition our heart according to the heart of Christ, then our position in this world will always, if we don't do that, our position will always be compromised. I'm going to step out of my sermon now and introduce another person to you this morning. Her name is Natasha Znova. She's also from Russia. No one knows where she is today. We know that she was an ex-communist agent and she left communism and became a believer. She worked with the churches in Russia, the Soviet Union. She was arrested several times and tortured for her faith. We don't know where she is today, probably dead, killed in one of the raids. That is Natasha. So we heard about Sergei and we heard about Natasha. I will come back to these 2 people in just a few minutes. Let's look at these 4 important responsibilities that we have, living as pilgrims. In chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, we are told, "Dear friends or dear brothers, I urge you as pilgrims and temporary residents to abstain from fleshly desires that war against you. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that in a case where they speak against you as those who do evil, they may be observing your good works, and glorify God in the day of visitation." The word pilgrim that is used there is the same word, aliens, that is used to describe Israel as they were scattered across Babylon when they were taken by the Babylonians into captivity. You see, when Israel was spread across Babylon, they had to live among pagan people. They could not live just as an isolated community. They had to live among pagan people, and the book of Daniel says that they were being forced to adapt to those pagan customs as well. We too are living and passing through this pagan world. We are like those children of Israel in the scattered across Babylon. We're living in a pagan world, but we are called not to become pagan. We are set apart, we are holy and dedicated to the Lord. This is what to be a pilgrim means. Not to be part of the world. You have to live in this world. We cannot be excluded from society. We often teach that as a believer we have to stay away from everything. But staying away doesn't mean exclusion. It means being able to resist the temptations of this world. And there is a reason for that. See, when you live in this world as a Christian, you're bearing the image of God. People around the world don't just look at me as Vinu or Hugh or Brother Hugh as Hugh, but they see the image of God in us. And in the day of visitation or the day of judgment, even those who don't believe will glorify God if we show that image. So the question this morning that we have to ask ourselves is, are we living as pilgrims? Are we integrated into this pagan society, or do we have our own identity as Christians in this pagan world? Do we have that separate identity or not? Are we of the world, or are we just living in this world with the image of God? This is the question that is posed to us by the apostle. When I was preparing this message, there is a particular movie that's being shown these days on the life of Apostle Paul. And certain scenes from that came to my mind about how this community, the Christian community, kept its identity and away from all the filth and evil of this world. That is what is being that's the challenge that the apostle is giving to us today. The second requirement, or the second duty that is given to us in this passage, is to be model citizens. Now, we need to understand when the Jews were, wherever the Jews went, they taught in their community that they were to submit themselves only to God. They didn't have to submit to anyone else. So they were always seen as a rebellious group. But here the Apostle Peter is encouraging the Christian believers to submit themselves to a hostile government, to a hostile group. You see, this was something that was very difficult. We gather for worship, we break bread, and we drink of the cup. In those days, when the believers came together and took part of this table, they started spreading rumors, those who are not believers, they started spreading rumors that a group of people used to come together in the evenings and they actually eat flesh and drink blood. And they were accused of being cannibals. And they were accused of incest. Everything that's contrary to scripture. So whenever they came out of these meetings, they were looked at as people who just ate flesh and blood. Something like the modern day satanic churches. This was the experience of the first century church. And we know from history that the Roman government looked at the believers as a group of people who were plotting against the government, like a political uprising. And so it is in this environment that the Apostle Peter is saying, don't retaliate. Instead, show the love of God and be submissive. Being submissive to rulers and authorities is a very debatable area. It's a gray area, especially for those of us who have come from the Middle East before migrating to Canada. We know what it means to be submissive and not submissive at the same time. It's not a very clear area to be in. Sometimes, as believers, we would have to say no, and as believers, sometimes we would just have to submit ourselves. Where do we draw the line? To understand this, we have to go back to the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve sinned, and we discussed this yesterday in the fasting and prayer, when Adam and Eve sinned, and they were sent out from the garden, they didn't just leave the garden with animal skins as clothes, but they also left the garden with a constitution. They left the garden with God's moral law imprinted on their hearts. And so from the very first family that became a community to a nation, to many nations, God's holy standards were already there, as it is told to us in Romans chapter 1 and 2. Rulers and people in authority, from governors, mayors, presidents, kings, queens, whoever they might be, they have been placed by God in these positions to show people where that moral law is. to show people where it is, what is right from wrong. And so when you have a law in the land which says do not murder, or do not steal, or do not cheat, those laws are coming from the moral standard that God has given to us. And so when the Apostle Peter is saying that we must be submissive to the authorities, in other words, he's saying, understand that the laws that they tell you to obey are laws which have been approved by God. But that does not make rulers ideal. They are also in sin and they do compromise. So where do we draw the line? We draw the line where we have to examine every law and ask ourselves, is this in line with what God has given to us? If it is, then we submit. If it is not, we resist. But resist in love. Now, that's where the boundaries of submission are. And we are told by the Apostle Peter to submit to good and bad rulers. Such submission is the best defense of the gospel. When you submit that way, you are seen as people who give honor. And when submission is done out of love, it shows the love and the grace of God. One commentator says, it shows it's a boastful approach to the love and grace of God. And so, before I move to the next point, I just want to come back to what I said. There are certain boundaries of submission. And the boundary is defined by what is God's moral law that He has given to each one of us. Coming to the next point, which is on submissive servants. Now, let's look at chapter 2, verse 18 to 20. Read with me. Household slaves, submit yourselves to your masters, and with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the cruel. For it brings favor if, because of conscience towards God, someone endures grief from suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if you endure when you sin and are beaten? But when you do good and suffer, if you endure it, it brings favor with God. We have to apply the context to this passage carefully here. You see, in those days, at the beginning of my sermon, I told you that when the believers were scattered and small churches started coming up, there were slaves also who came to the salvation experience and were added to the church. When they went back to their homes to work as slaves, some of them were forced to take part in pagan rituals. That also included immoral sexual acts that were done in these Roman homes. And so these slaves were always under stress because as believers, as Christians, they were not allowed to do this. And so when they resisted, when they said, no, this is against my faith. Remember, as a slave, you don't have a right. As a slave, you have to obey because you're purchased and you're a property, not a person. And so when a slave would resist and say, no, I won't do it, the punishment was severe. He would be beaten up, he would be forced to go without food, he would be tortured. And it is to these slaves that the Apostle Peter is saying that when you get persecuted, when you suffer unjustly, then God is honoring you. God honors that. You see, the question that the slaves had to answer was, should I cross the boundaries of holiness? When you look at a lot of history on this passage and read through what was happening at that time, it's very moving because they went through so much of persecution, they went through so much of physical torture because they resisted being part of pagan rituals just because of their faith. And so when they did that, they had to suffer. They had to suffer in the most horrible ways. And so God says through the apostle that brings favor from God. And the last point is about marriage. Now, here we find two cases that are given to us in chapter 3, verse 1 to 7. Let me just read that for you. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that even if some disobey the Christian message, they may be won over without a message by the way their wives live. When they observe your pure, reverent lives, your beauty should not consist of outward things like elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold ornaments or fine clothes. Instead, it should consist of the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of the heart, quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very valuable in God's eyes. For in the past, the holy women who hoped in God also beautified themselves in this way, submitting to their own husbands. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, you have become her children when you do good and unfrightened by anything alarming. Husbands, in the same way, live with your wife with understanding of their weaker nature, yet showing them honors as co-heirs of the grace of the life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. So there are two sets of instructions given to us in this passage. One for the wife and one for the husband. But if you carefully look at the instructions, for the wife, it deals with how a wife should win an unbelieving husband over. That means a husband who has not come to the faith. But in the case of the husband, the instruction is to build a model home so that both husband and wife will be joint heirs of the grace of life. This is a distinction in the two parts of this passage, from verse 1 to verse 7. This was particularly significant because history tells us that it was women in married homes that first came to the Lord. Very often when the gospel message went out, before the husbands would turn to the Lord, in many homes it was the wives who first came to the Lord, brought their children over, and over a period of time, the husband would also join into the faith. And so when the Apostle Peter says, submit yourselves to the wives, the message there was similar to the same message given to become ideal citizens and submissive slaves. In other words, we know what problems you go through, we know what troubles you will go through when you submit in your homes, but submit yourselves for the larger purpose, for the bigger purpose of winning them over. Now in this passage there is a reference to wearing ornaments, but if you look at this carefully, it's not specifically an instruction on what ornaments you can wear and what you cannot wear. It's more a reference to why we should not be obsessed with our physical beauty. When we come for meetings, when we come and gather for worship, where is our obsession? I've heard this story about how the Israelites would go for worship. And in that story, when the high priest would go into the inner sanctuary, it was a very, graphic illustration of how this happens. The entire nation would be standing there, and the high priest would cross the altar, and then he would go into the most holy place. Until he comes out, the nation is not sure if his sacrifice has been accepted or not. Nothing could distract them from focusing their eyes onto the most holy place. And that's exactly what is required of us here. When we come for worship, when we come to gather together in an assembly meeting, where are our obsessions? The Apostle Peter is telling us that we should not be so obsessed with our physical beauty, but instead to be obsessed with our godly character. And finally we read here, husbands in the same way, live with your wives with understanding of their weaker nature. There are 5 points that we can see in just this one verse, and it all deals with living. It talks about a common life, a life of understanding, a life of giving honor, a life in patience, and then living as heirs. This is what we see in just this one verse. To live in a model home means to live as one common life. To live in mutual understanding, to live by giving honor to one another, to live in patience, and to live with the understanding that any gift that God gives us, any blessing that God gives us, is equally shared between the husband and the wife. I've heard of the story of Billy Graham, who came out of a message one day, and the people around him said, you did a great job and God will bless you with crowns and jewels when you enter heaven. And he said, no, I'll only get a third of it. 2/3 will go to my wife. So the point here is, it is about living one common life. And the blessing that comes is jointly inherited between the husband and the wife. So this morning, we looked at what it means to be God's people in a broken world. We saw that we need to be distinct. We saw that we are self-controlled people and we are influencing people. With this character in mind, we also understood that there are 4 sets of responsibilities that have come to us. Responsibilities that come to us because we are not permanent citizens here. Instead, we are pilgrims. We need to be model citizens. Citizen of heaven and citizen of earth at the same time. Submissive servants to harsh masters and to building homes. We also saw that the 7 qualities of Christ that he displayed on the cross will help us in fulfilling these duties. The character of forgiveness, the quality of being evangelistic, the quality of being selfless, of being holy, of being enduring, of being complete, and of entrusting ourselves to the righteous judge. That will help us to live as pilgrims. That will help us to live as citizens of heaven on earth. That will help us to be model servants and to build ideal homes. I come back to my last slide, or the last part of my message. I told you that I'll come back to the story. We started off by talking about Sergei Kordakov, and then we introduced Natasha. What's the connection between the two, and how does it relate to this passage? You see, Sergei was part of a group with the KGB, that's like the CIA in the US, KGB in Russia. They would go out looking for these secret churches. And once they enter these churches, once they find Christians gathering together in secret, they would go and bang and open the doors, and then they would actually punch them. They would beat them, they would torture them inside those rooms. And they used to actually share trophies, like how many Christians did you knock out in one punch? If you knocked out 10, you would get a trophy that day. In one of those raids by Sergei Kordakov, Natasha was in one of those meetings. And she was beaten up and she was tortured several times by not just Sergei Kordakov, but even by the others. History tells us, or Sergei himself writes about this in a book called Forgive Me, Natasha, where he says that he met the same girl on a couple of other, in a few other places, and she went through the same amount of torture. But it was her grace, it was her response that haunted him. It was not so much the blood, it was not so much all the crying and pain, but it was her grace that haunted him. And so years later, he left the KGB. He took on a job in the Navy with the aim of coming out of this. And every night he would go to sleep. He couldn't go to sleep because this image of Natasha and her grace kept haunting him. He never met Natasha after that, but he was so haunted by her grace that he left Russia, defected to Canada, came to the US and became a Christian, in fact a missionary, and he was speaking in many churches across the US. In 1973, we understand that he was hunted down by the KGB and killed in a small hotel room. Case never became public. It was all kept under wraps because there's so many political sensitivities around that. But the point that I want to bring to you this morning is that just like Natasha, there were many other Christians who went through suffering, lived as pilgrims, model citizens, submissive servants, building model homes, and the grace that they showed through that haunted those who persecuted